I want to thank everyone for coming and introduce myself. I'm Cheryl Dorchinsky from the Atlanta Israel Coalition. We're very fortunate today to have Bassem Eid, and we're fortunate today to be here with our wonderful partners from Weber, the Weber Rams. Want to thank all of our sponsors, our promotional partners for being here with us. Stand with us, and we have quite a bit. I'm hoping the slide will come up. Not that slide, but the next slide with all of our partners. Thank you. Lee is behind the magic. We appreciate your help, Lee. So IAC, B'nai B'rith, Stand With Us, Hadassah Chaya Evolve, Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. Hello.
Yes, you hearing me?
Hi. I'm just thanking our promotional partners, and then I will definitely be introducing you.
Please.
Okay. Southern Jewish Life, Israeli Insight, Genesis, Foundation 123, Beth Jacob, Congregation Etzchaim, Beth Shalom, Congregation B'nai Torah, St. Louis Friends of Israel, Hebrew Order for David, and the Kosher Barbecue. I also want to thank Gail Foreman and the Evans family and Lee Tenenbaum for all her magic behind the scenes. Awesome. Can you turn your camera on?
Let's see. Yes,
there you are.
Yeah.
Thank you
Great.
for being here with us today.
Thank you, Cheryl, very much.
I just want to say we're going to have some time for questions from the audience. So please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A. We're hoping to get to everybody's questions, but we only have an hour together. If you have questions after, don't hesitate to message us on Atlanta Israel Coalition's Facebook page or email us, and we'll do our best to get your answers. Please keep in mind when you're asking these questions that Atlanta Israel Coalition is nonpartisan, we're non-denominational, and for all ages and stages. Appreciate you keeping that in mind when you ask your questions and keeping it along those lines. Bassem, welcome. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. You're a human rights pioneer. You were put in prison for speaking the truth. And I was hoping you could tell us a bit about your background, where you're from, how that happened, and what you're working on today.
Yeah. I born, by the way, in Jerusalem city and mainly in the Jewish quarter, in the old city of Jerusalem, under the Jordanian occupation in that time.
Okay.
And for no reason, in 1966, which is exactly 1 year before the 67 war, the Jordanian government decided to evacuate 500 Palestinian families from the Jewish quarter and to locate them in the north of Jerusalem in a place called Shuafat refugee camp, which is between the French Hill and Pisgat Ze'ev. So who made me a refugee is the Jordanian government. So I grown up in that refugee camp for 33 years with my brothers, with my parents. Only in 1999, I succeed to remove from that camp after I bought an apartment outside the camp. So a person who lived in a refugee camp for 33 years almost suffered because we don't have the same normal life of the others who are living outside the camp. UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency used to be responsible on that refugee camp. We used to have small clinic there, 2 schools, 1 boys, 1 girls, and let me call it a very primitive way of life. Till today, I have still 6 brothers living in that refugee camp, and every week or 2 weeks, I have to go and to visit them. And I think that the situation in that refugee camp became worse and worse because UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, all the time complaining on a shortage of funding, which I don't know. The 1.6 billion dollars a year, I don't know where is UNRWA really spending them. People just suffering, not only in the West Bank refugee camp or in the Gaza camps, but also in the other Arab countries, camps like Jordan, like Syria, like Lebanon. So there are facts on the ground these days. The facts are that the life of the Palestinians under the Israelis much, much, much better than it is under any other Arab country around the world. I have uncles living in refugee camps in Jordan. They are suffering. When I look to them, I found that I am living in a paradise under the Israelis. Everything, I have it. I have a free medical treatment by the Israelis in the best hospitals in the Middle East, which my uncle in Jordan don't have the same free treatment in the hospitals in Jordan. So when I realize the facts here, I start telling the truth and I start teaching people what does it mean Israel and what does it mean Palestinians and what does it mean Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So were you put in prison for teaching that by the Israelis?
No, never ever been arrested by the Israelis. Even during my human rights work in Bethlehem for 7.5 years, I was very critical to the Israeli authority on the violations of human rights against the Palestinians, and I never ever been arrested by the Israelis. The opposite, the Israeli media gave me a huge stage to come and to criticize Israel on its human rights violations towards the Palestinians. But after the Oslo Agreement and after the arrival of the Palestinian Authority in 1994 to the West Bank and Gaza, when I switched my work from monitoring the Israeli violations to monitor the Palestinian Authority violations, in 96, I was arrested by Yasser Arafat in that time. But I was so lucky that I kept in jail only for 5 hours. And the American administration in that time under Bill Clinton and the Secretary of the State in that time, Warren Christopher. Warren Christopher is the one who involved directly in my release. He just called Yasser Arafat in that time and telling him that you have 5 minutes to release Bassem Eid from the prison. So this is the price that the Palestinian Authority gave to me on my work on the Israeli violations of human rights against the Palestinians.
So since you've been released, are people able to speak freely over there? Or has there still been people getting arrested for speaking to Israelis, speaking to the press, speaking out? Are they allowed to have free speech?
And I think that I am a lucky person that I was arrested by the Palestinian Authority for 25 hours, because that arrest already gave me a huge impunity from the Palestinian Authority. Because during my arrest, the Palestinian Authority realized that I am an international figure, not a local figure.
Right.
So since that time, I am criticizing the Palestinian Authority very openly every day. And besides that, I used to live in Jericho for 12 years, which is completely under the sovereignty of the Palestinian Authority. So I never ever face any problems. And I think that the Palestinian Authority right now taking me as a fact on the ground, because sometimes I hear that the Palestinian Authority itself, it tried to use me when any minister, mentioning the democracy, the human rights. Then Mahmoud Abbas said, listen, take Bassem Eid as an example. He is criticizing us 24 hours and we never try to touch him. So don't talk about democracy and human rights. We are living in a full democracy here.
Is that the
So
truth? Are they a full democracy? Is there all the democracy over there?
Yeah, all the democracy. It's better than America there.
Now I know you're kidding.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
But, so in Israel, you are allowed free speech, and you're living there right now in East Jerusalem, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think that with the Israelis, we don't have any problem. Israel, well known as the only democratic state in the Middle East. Nobody can deny that. I think that in Israel, there are three important things which is so valuable for life. It is dignity, it is justice, it is freedoms. These are the most three issues that you need for a good life. And this is what we have right now under the Israelis. I think that the dignity and the justice and the freedoms that I have these days under the Israelis, no one other Arab have it under his own Arab country.
Well, I was reading today that, and if we could put up the slide, the quote, here we go, that the Palestinian Authority, who calls Israel apartheid, has acted against Israel for years, and he's suffering from COVID. I know it's a lockdown over there right now, right?
Right.
But why do these people call Israel an apartheid state if you're living in Israel and they're being treated for diseases like COVID in Israeli hospitals?
See, in my opinion, Cheryl, the word of apartheid, which has been used, a lot by Palestinians and a lot by South African, by the way. In my opinion, it became just a slogan. It has no facts on the ground here. But just people want to criticize Israel. This is why they are calling Israel an apartheid. Israel never ever been an apartheid. If you will go to the hospitals these days, you will find that over than 70% of the patients are Arabs. Over than 70%. Listen, I must have to tell you that my father worked in Hadassah Hospital in Karim for 35 years. I used to go, like every month to visit him over there and to see the Israeli treatment to the Arab patients in that hospital. So I have a very long experience in my life with Hadassah Hospital. So to come today and to say that Israel is an apartheid, I think that the people who are saying that Israel is an apartheid, they don't know anything about Israel. And I would like to invite them to come to Israel and to check in their own eyes if Israel is really an apartheid or not. And this is why the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions organization, is trying to prohibit any kind of tours from outside to Israel. Because if those people will arrive to Israel, then they will realize that the BDS movement is just a big lie. And that the BDS movement has its own political agenda. And the BDS movement never ever been a human rights organization. The main aim of the BDS these days is how to destroy Israel, but not to bring any peace between Israel and the Palestinians.
Speaking of peace, how do most Palestinians feel about the different agreements that are going on right now? It seems to me that it's a step in the right direction. How do you feel, and what sense do you get from others?
I think that the majority of the Palestinians these days almost is stuck nowhere because of our own leadership, not because the Israelis. Today, Israel is not looks like 20 years ago. 20 years ago, probably Israel was isolated by the Arab countries. But these days, Israel became more and more friendly to the Arab countries. And the Arab countries start realizing two important issues about Israel. That Israel has a very high technology and Israel has a very high security. And I think what the world needs these days is technology and security. And looks like that some Arab countries, like the Kingdom of Bahrain and United Arab Emirates, start realizing that with peace with Israel, they only can benefit from Israel. They will never lose anything from Israel. And I think that that's brought the great, let me call it, agreement between those two Arab countries and Israel. I hope that the Palestinian leadership will start learning something from that. But unfortunately, I am a very pessimistic person from the current Palestinian leadership. I don't think that the current Palestinian leadership, that they want to make any peace with Israel. No, they don't want. They want to call for incitement against Israel, for more hatred against Israel. Why? Because the current Palestinian leadership want to keep the situation today as a status quo. They want the conflict to continue, because why the conflict continue, only the leadership benefiting from it. And look to the hundreds of millions which is coming every month, which is nobody knows exactly where these hundreds of millions has been spent every month by the Palestinian Authority. So that's the status quo that the Palestinian Authority is fighting for to achieve it.
And so when we're talking about leadership, we're only talking about the PLO and not Hamas?
Yes, of course, no doubt that here I am talking about the PA in the West Bank and the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I think that the Hamas these days, or let's say since the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, they are just sacrificing 2 million innocent people in the Gaza Strip. Sacrificing them for what? For the Iranian political agenda. The Iranian agenda today is one important thing: how to continue disturbing the Israeli internal security. And this is how they are using the Hamas in the south of Israel. And this is how they are using the Hezbollah in the north of Israel. And that's the main goal that I think that the Palestinians in Gaza are paying for, and the Lebanese people are paying for.
Okay, well, I appreciate the clarification. We have with us our partners from Rams of Israel, the Weber School, High School. Michal, can you come on? She is an advisor. Hi.
Hi,
And
Cheryl.
she has a wonderful student with her. They have some questions from the school. I'm going to give you the stage.
Thank you, Cheryl. First of all, thank you so much to the Atlanta Israel Coalition for partnering with us, putting this together. And Bassem, thank you so much for being an important voice for our students who are tomorrow's leaders. I would like to invite Carly, who is the Stand With Us intern and the co-president of the Rams for Israel, to ask her friends questions. And thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you. Hi.
How did your family react to your views on Israel?
Listen, sometimes when people used to ask me about my security, I used to ask them if they are running any insurance companies. So I'm living very well. My family also knows the truth very well, because they are living in the same situation. And I am feeling really so good. You know, sometimes when I am appearing on the Israeli TV, by the way, and talking about the situation, on the next day, people facing me on the street by saying, oh, we loved what you said yesterday night. It was so nice. It was so true, but we couldn't say it. You can say it, because you are a person with impunity. You have a kind of an international protection, so you can do it. You are the voice of those who don't have voices.
A lot of us students are about to go to college, and we're wondering how we should talk about BDS with students who are pro-Palestine and support BDS in college.
See, I think that the colleges in the United States became very complicated. You know, I'm a person who made a lot of tours to different campuses around the US by Stand With Us and by camera organization. And I really felt sometimes, are you with me?
Yes.
Yeah. I am feeling sometimes that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is much more in the campuses of the US rather than it is in Ramallah and Jerusalem. And I'm wondering why people are fighting there. Why people are fighting in the campuses of the United States. You don't have problems in the United States? Of course you have. So try to deal with your own problems. And we will deal with our own problems. Don't try to represent and don't try to enforce any kind of solution on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that you have in the campuses some horrible organizations like the BDS, like the Students for Justice of Palestine, right? Like the Jewish Voice of Peace. I think that these people just would love to continue this conflict because they are the only one who are benefiting from that conflict. You are talking about a very rich organizations. And these people seems to me that they have been jobless and they found jobs forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another question is, what is the overall sentiment in Palestine about Hamas?
See, the Hamas, I think that the Hamas these days almost recognized by the Arab countries as a terrorist organization.
Mm-hmm.
Look how is Egypt these days dealing with the Gaza Strip. I think that Gaza has been under closure from the Egyptian side rather than from the Israeli side. And I think that I have a lot of friends, you know, in Gaza, and I'm talking with them sometimes like every day. The situation in Gaza is horrible. As I said, that the Hamas right now are sacrificing 2 million innocent residents in the Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hamas leaders just want to be more and more rich from the current situation. And I don't think that there is any way right now how to get rid from the Hamas organization in Gaza. Looks like it's very difficult. And you can see right now how the Hamas is divided from the Fatah and how the Gaza Strip divided from the West Bank. And looks like that this kind of division in the Palestinian cause will create more and more difficulties in the way of peace in the near future.
Oh, that's interesting. So how do you think that Palestinians can vote out Hamas or get a new government? Is it possible?
I don't think that it is possible. You know, sometimes I used to ask people, why not to make a kind of a Gazan spring? You remember the Arab Spring, yeah? I said, try to make a Gazan strip, a spring, maybe to get rid from the Hamas. You know what the answer of the people was? That if the Iranian spring will succeed, the Gazan spring will succeed. And we can see in Iran these days and in the past, people who try to criticize the regime over there has been either killed or arrested. And this is one of the major problems there, that people are living under a kind of fear that they couldn't speak, they couldn't practice any kind of rights. And while you are restricted, you couldn't do anything in terms to change the situation.
Wow. Do you know any ways that us in America can improve cooperation between Palestinians?
See, I think that there are some American organizations who are really doing, very well, let's say, in terms to improve the situation of the Palestinians. I am a person who used to say that we are welcoming any help from anybody around the world. But in the meantime, I am warning everybody around the world to touch the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has two owners, the Palestinians and the Israelis. And who is only allowed to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be only the Palestinians and the Israelis, but not any other third party here. So there are people who are trying, to provide aid, to provide, projects, to provide such kind of help to the Palestinians, which is really very appreciated. But in the meantime, I want the leaders of the world to start putting pressure on the current Palestinian leadership, that the Palestinian leadership couldn't stuck where they are. They should have to move forward or to leave the area. The international community couldn't continue supporting such kind of a handicapped leadership. This leadership is totally handicapped, and the international community should have to start putting a little bit of pressure in terms to move forward.
Thank you, Bassem, and thank you so much, Carly, for your leadership and the wonderful questions. There was another question that just came in, and
yes,
here, are you getting any exposure in the Arab world other than what you discussed?
See, the Arab world these days is living under its own problems. Each Arab country today is stuck nowhere. Libya as an example. Look to Syria. Look to Iraq. Look to Yemen. I used to say, Michal, that if we will look to the Middle East map these days and how the Islamic terror growing and growing, we will find that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is probably the most safe place in the Middle East. As a Muslim, as an Arab, I don't want to be in Syria. I don't want to be in Libya. I don't want to be in Iraq. I don't want to be in Yemen. It's much safe for me and my children to continue living under the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because that's the most safe place, in my opinion, in all of the Middle East. Yeah.
Thank you. Cheryl,
Thank you.
Other questions that are coming in?
Yes, actually we do. How common do you think your views are in the Palestinian society? And what is the attitude of your work from the other organizations?
See, I am a completely independent person. I refuse to be affiliated with any organization around the world. If it is Arab, if it is Jewish, if it is American, if it is German, if it is Italian, never mind. I want to keep my own independency because most of the organizations in this world have their own political agenda. And I am against any kind of a political agenda. I am a person who don't want to obey any kind of a political agenda. So I am a little bit try to keep distance, let's say, from those political organizations. And I am feeling very good with what I am doing right now around the world. I think that my message these days became wider and wider, and there is a lot of demand, not only, by the way, from American organizations or American campuses, but even in Europe. I start receiving, invitations right now, mainly in Spain, mainly in Germany, mainly in the UK, and that's, give the impression that doors start opening slowly towards what I am saying and what I am doing.
Perfect. So as a Palestinian, how do you remember Yitzhak Rabin on the 25th anniversary of his assassination? We have a viewer who wants to know.
I remember, very well that event, unfortunately. I remember that the Jerusalem Post on the a day before the assassination published 3 pages as a profile of my story. But unfortunately, the assassination immediately followed the publication of the story, and I believe nobody read the story in the Jerusalem Post in that time, because everybody is much more, worry and care about the case of Yitzhak Rabin. It's very sad. It's really very sad. But in the meantime, I must have to say that by assassinating Yitzhak Rabin, it doesn't mean that the Jewish people are against peace. At all not. This is not the message. It is exactly the opposite. I think that the majority of the Jewish people right now, if they are in Israel or even outside Israel, would love to see peace tomorrow morning. So the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, in my opinion, couldn't be related to any future peace between Israel and the Arab world. So this is the message that I think that everybody should have to understand and should have to realize, that the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin doesn't mean that the Jewish people are against peace.
Amen. I'd have to agree with that, wouldn't you? Michal and Carly?
There's one question that came in from my students, and I know we touched a little bit on your sentiments about organizations and how you like to be independent, but I do have students who next year, God willing, will be on university campuses in the US, where there's a lot of Israel bashing, many lies. Things are said that are not based on any kind of truth, and it's mostly very sentimental. I wanted to ask you if you can give us a list of organizations that you have seen work on university campuses that I can tell my students, go and be partners with them? Are there such organizations that you can identify?
See, let me tell you, Michal, and your students, one important thing. Jewish students must have to be proud wherever they are going. You have a very strong nation. You have a very strong country. This is the fact. Never mind what the others are saying. The fact is that Israel is the strongest and the most democratic state in the Middle East. This is the fact that your students should have to hold and to go around the campuses in the United States. Just to stand up and to say, I am proud that I am Jewish. Secondly, of course, that there are some organizations on the campuses. Students for Israel, I think that there is, in every university, you can find such kind of groups. I personally invited by those organizations many times around the US. And there are, of course, very good organizations. Probably I don't remember them, but there are. And I think that students should have to be very careful, not to listen to the lies of the other organizations like the BDS, like the Students for Justice for Palestine, like the Jewish Voice for Peace. These are three organizations that your students should have to consider them as the main enemies of the state of Israel. Other organizations, you can attend, you can participate, you can debate, but be careful from those three organizations. I think that the students should have to be like ambassadors in their campuses and just to tell everybody the good things and the many good things that it is almost exist in Israel. A lot of good things they can tell the other students in the campuses, and I wish them, your students, a very successful future.
Amen. Thank you.
AIC is definitely a source. Anyone, any student who needs support, please, feel free to even contact me directly. We're always happy to help. This is important to all of us.
And
So
Cheryl, this
down
is
together.
the first of many partnerships that we will have to benefit our students. There was a question that came in. Somebody wanted you to speak about your sentiment of the move of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So your own personal thoughts and how the Palestinian world sees it. So thank you.
Let me start with that, Michal. I am very happy that they moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. You know why? Because when I want to apply for a visa, it costs me less money in Jerusalem than to travel to Tel Aviv. Secondly, the embassy, by the way, has been transferred from Tel Aviv to West Jerusalem, not to East Jerusalem. Why the Palestinians are really so angry on that? The Israeli Knesset is located in West Jerusalem. We never been against that because West Jerusalem is a part of the state of Israel. It's well recognized everywhere. So by moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to West Jerusalem, I think that this is the American affair and nobody has the right to interfere in it. But you know, it has been used. The moving of the embassy has been used as a kind of propaganda by the Palestinian Authority. By the way, I didn't see any criticism against moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by any other Arab country, by the way. And recently I hear that the peace accord which has been signed between the Kingdom of Bahrain and United Arab Emirates and Israel looks like that the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain are going to open their embassies in Jerusalem. So, so don't be worried, just be happy.
That's great advice. Carly, did you have another question?
Yeah, I did. A question came in asking about how Palestinians are taught about Israel growing up.
See, we have a problem, I think, in our education system. I think that our education system containing a lot of hatred, a lot of incitement, a lot of violence against Israel. Because I can see these days that the new generation is more violent towards Israel than the first generation or the before generation. You know, people today are much more care about their own economic situation. And people are not really giving so many attention to the politics which is going around. Because the economic situation, unfortunately, decreasing. And I want to mention, you know, also the coronavirus or the COVID-19, which is almost became so heavy on the shoulders of the Palestinians. You know, when Israel imposed a closure, as an example, the Palestinian workers are really suffering from that because we don't have any alternative jobs in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. The main income of the Palestinians is the working inside Israel. And this is what I used to say all the time. Imagine if Israel will boycott the Palestinians one day. What will happen? What will happen? Will the BDS provide us jobs? Will the BDS sending salaries to the Palestinian workers? Of course not. So unfortunately, I think that the international community must have to impose more and more pressure on the current Palestinian Authority to change the current Palestinian curriculum in the schools. Because I am a person who believes that peace starts from the education, not from anywhere else. And I wish that the international community will start realizing that education of peace is the only one which might bring peace in the near future.
Thank you, Bassem. Two questions. We'll do the first one. We wanted to know, what is your opinion about the debate occurring in Israel today about annexation of the West Bank?
See, I know this debate many years ago. And I know about some right-wing parties who are demanding the annexation probably 10 years ago. In the meantime, I don't think that the current Israeli Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, I don't think that he is really very interesting with that. Because that's probably will bring a huge criticism towards Israel. But in the meantime, 99.9% of the Palestinians would love to see the annexation tomorrow morning. Because we prefer to continue living under the Israelis rather than under the Hamas in Gaza or Abbas in the West Bank. Because we know the Israelis very well. And we learned in the past 53 years how to benefit from the Israelis. So I am not quite sure that this annexation will take place very soon. You know, there was also a huge debate recently about the peace accord between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates start spreading rumors that they are doing such kind of peace because Israel promised to stop the annexation. On the next day, what Bibi Netanyahu told us? Bibi Netanyahu told us that he never ever stopped the annexation, but he is going to delay the annexation. So I don't know whatever, has been agreed between the both sides, but in my opinion, Bibi Netanyahu is not speeding towards the annexation right now. Yeah.
Interesting, thank you. And the other question,
Yes.
we have heard, and you and I spoke about this before, about the concern of textbooks in Palestinian schools, preschools, even universities, with either not mentioning Israel or mentioning Israel very unfavorably. We want you to speak of that so my students hear about this issue. This is not something that people speak about in the US. And also tell us if there's anybody within the Palestinian world addressing it, looking at it, trying to change it.
Unfortunately not. I don't know about anybody who is trying to change the Palestinian education system these days. We used to say in Turkish language, Israel yok. Yok means in Turkish language, not exist. Israel is yok. Israel is not existing in the textbooks of the Palestinian. These days, in the Palestinian media, you know what they call Israel? The occupied 1948 territories. This is the name of Israel these days in the Palestinian media. So sometimes I'm asking myself, why Abbas is demanding peace with Israel? If Israel is not exist, why you want to make peace with someone who is not exist? Excuse me, explain to us. Israel is not exist in your textbooks, in your media, in your thinking. So why you are demanding peace with Israel? That's one of the major problems here. I think, Michal, that the major problem is the international community. Because who is funding the Palestinian educational system? Who is funding? Europe. So sometimes it looks like that Europe is using the Palestinians against Israel. I don't believe that the Europeans loves the Palestinians. I don't believe in that. But they are using us. And you have to know, Michal, one important thing, that anti-Semitism born in Europe, not in the Arab countries. And that's the point. That looks like that Europe wants to go back to its history by using the Palestinians against the Israelis. And I think that that's makes the international community a part of the conflict rather than it is a part of the solution. I didn't see any leader right now in Europe that he is interested for any kind of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Look to them, what they are doing to bring peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, just nothing. Very sad.
Agreed. It is very sad.
It is.
I wish we had all the time in the, really, I do. We continue to get questions and unfortunately we are running out of time. So Bassem, thank you so much for being here. Michal, Carly, Weber Rams of Israel, you're amazing. Bassem, we hope to work with you again soon and thank you all. I just want to thank our promotional partners again and let everybody know to please follow us on Facebook, join our mailing list. We have an activist series coming up that we're partnering with AIC on. We have a virtual tour that we will not be charging the public for, the Old City for Hanukkah, and many more exciting programs coming up. Hopefully partnering with these wonderful people that you see here. And if you still have questions that haven't been answered, don't hesitate to reach out to AIC on Facebook Messenger or email us. Thank you again, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you.
And thank you, AIC. This is wonderful. And thank you,
Michal.
students, Carly, and everybody else. You fill my heart with such nachas. I love your questions. I love your participation. So go Ram.
I really appreciate it. I like it very much. And just as I said, no worries, be happy.